We're not seeing it here.
Sorry, committees.
Okay, let's see. Okay, it's on.
Okay.
It's on.
Ian, you see it? We're good?
We can see you now.
Great. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Secretary. Please continue.
Okay, we're just going to make sure we're muted so we don't get any backfeed through your system, Mr. Chairman. Hold on. Okay, we're all muted here? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
We're not hearing him.
Okay, we see you. I see you.
Okay.
Where I was left off was that our office was faced with the overwhelming universal demand of all PPE and many medical products consumed by our global supply chain. We were facing a lack of supply, suppliers, failed orders, back orders, long lead times, and other challenges, all that contributed to the disruption of the global PPE supply chain, which was made more difficult by geopolitics and framed in a landscape that shifted daily as federal, state, and local governments competed for reliable sources for the same product. Mr. Chairman, do you need me to stop? You're not on the screen.
Hello?
Please continue.
Okay.
Please continue.
The success of our office to urgently source and contract, as well as transport materials to Maryland during the months of March and April, was deemed a matter of life and death for so many Marylanders entering our health system. And I understand that the picture I'm painting for you in the committee sounds dramatic, but this was our situation. In a normal emergency, this office relies upon standard state contracts to place orders for materials. And this usually reliable resource quickly ran dry, with vendors noting extended lead times to allow production of materials on the order of 4 to 6 weeks, a time period that the state simply did not have the luxury to wait for critical materials to arrive. In response, the Office of State Procurement pivoted to the spot market to secure materials quickly. We set up go teams that were tasked with making contact with the overwhelming and increasing list of vendors that were reaching out to the state. In addition, the office received referrals from well-intentioned people with the goal of providing critical help for the people of Maryland. Our office leveraged our established processes and with the assistance of positioned resources within the Departments of Commerce, Health, Transportation, we successfully negotiated this difficult time. Now, at this time, I'd like to take a minute to walk through a couple of the slides to frame the engagement of the Office of State Procurement as required by our client agency, which was the Maryland Emergency Management Agency and the Maryland Department of Health. Afterwards, Mr. Gleason will review our procurement processes, leaving as much time as possible to answer the committee's questions. I would direct the committee's
Mr. Secretary, you would like
to slide 3.
Okay. You could put up split screen with the slides and slide 3.
Are you able to see it, Senator Pensky?
I'm sorry?
Are you able to see it?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. 1 second. Okay.
Apologize, committee members.
Sorry about this. Okay, I have it on share screen.
Yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
go to slide 3.
That's it.
okay. Please continue, Mr. Secretary.
All right, thank you, Chairman Pinsky. Slide 3. This slide is useful to understand the phase 1 of our procurement strategy, which we term react and respond. The slide is a snapshot of the PPE referenced in my opening remarks and the PPE usage throughout Maryland, including EMS, hospitals, long-term care facilities, law enforcement, and corrections. The data is compiled through voluntary reporting to MEMA and MDH. The column on the left are the estimated quantities of daily use. And again, within the healthcare industry, this is based mostly on a disposable product, which means it's a one-time use. Moving to the right of the first column, slide shows and reports that hospitals and long-term care facilities are the majority of the state's use for PPE. And this is important because when their supply is interrupted, they will turn to the state as a safety net. And below the top chart, the bottom chart notes, which is in blue, the 14-day consumption rate for the top 5 PPE items. And the chart on the far right is a comparison of received material to the state versus distributed to our local health agencies and state use as tracked by MDH. I'm now going to move to slide 4. And Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to pause until the slide comes on the screen, unless you want me to continue.
It's up. We have it. It's up, Mr. Secretary.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This slide is a snapshot of materials ordered, received, and the remaining balance of materials due to the state. It represents millions of units of material being ordered, mostly in March and April, and we are currently in a pause as we prepare to move into phase 2 of our procurement strategy, which we term stabilize, sustain, and replenish. I'll move on to slide 5.
Mr. Secretary, before we leave number 4, let's go back to number
Yes,
4
sir.
if we could. The left-hand.
I'm on number 4.
doesn't
Yes,
have a
sir.
distribution. Yeah, the left-hand side left off the distribution column. The right side has distribution. And I'm wondering why. In other
Right.
words,
Well, the right hand, I'm sorry, go ahead, sir. I'll let you complete your question.
I guess the question is, while we may have received it, if they're, how do we know if they're being utilized or not?
Well, that is a question, of course, that the Maryland Department of Health can provide as a part of their inventory and distribution plan. I don't have it represented here. This is the official Maryland Executive Report, but we can make a note if the committee is interested in seeing that. It's a very healthy distribution. The left-hand table is the state resources. The right-hand table is the resources that are received from the federal government. And so they are distributed pretty well first.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I don't want to slow things down, but I think members of the public and the committee are very interested in the bottom item to see how many have actually gone in the field and been utilized. If you don't know the answer, please talk with the Department of Health.
Well, I know a report exists. I do not have it for a presentation today.
That's
and
fine.
I would ask that our team just follow up with the committee and with health concerning supplying that report.
Thank you. Please continue.
You're welcome. All right. I'm going to move, unless there are any other questions about this slide. And I guess I should ask, Chairman, was there a question about the previous slide in
No,
3 before I move on to
Mr.
slide 5?
Mr. Secretary, we're generally going to hold questions till after you completed your presentation. Get through it.
All right, sir, I will continue. Just let me know when you want me to start speaking about slide 5.
Please continue.
All right. This slide 5, is a snapshot of the MEMA system, which is identified through a platform we call Web EOC. And it's the platform that the local healthcare agencies in each county, local jurisdictions, and the state agencies use to enter their needs to MEMA. This is a cumulative report, and the current slide shows that there's more than 1,600 requests that have been entered into Web EOC. Once they are entered, the requests are evaluated and moved on to state agencies to help fulfill as a part of their focus and mission. The overwhelming requests to date are PPE and disinfecting supplies, but we've included on the bottom of the slide a more robust list of items that were requested that include both PPE, non-PPE, and services. And as you can see, every county is represented on the bottom, and our state agencies, as part of their request, are noted as a part of the top graph. And there still remain, and will continue to remain, open items that the state is looking to source and fulfill. So at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to our CPO, Robert Gleason, to discuss our challenges and our process through our engagement period. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good afternoon, Chairman Pinsky and members of the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee. For the record, my name is Robert Gleason. I am the Chief Procurement Officer. I thought it would be helpful if I could provide my own perspective on the challenges that we faced, Maryland faced, and then following that, I'll move to the process that we use to address those challenges. I can say, in all honesty, in 25 years of public procurement, I've never seen anything like this, and it's been an extreme challenge, but I believe we have stepped up. The challenge for me began on March 13th. The Secretary mentioned that we met on Camp Frederick on March 15th, but for me, I remember March 13th because it was Friday the 13th, and I remembered that distinctly, thinking, what's going to happen? But Camp Frederick was where the challenges were outlined for us, and that those challenges emerged in the following weeks, in which case we were asked to prepare for a surge capacity of an estimated 6,000 COVID-positive patients who would be needing a range of care and medical supervision over the next several months. The Department of Health estimated for us a 4-phase need that we would have to prepare for. There would be approximately 1,200 patients needed for observation, and then an additional 2,100 for acute care, and then 1,500 for critical care, all of whom would be in hospitals, and then another 1,200 more would be in acute medical sites that we would have to prepare for. That requirement would need for us to encompass and work with cooperatively all political subdivisions, all of the hospitals, and I counted 47. We had to create a 250-bed field medical hospital at the Baltimore Convention Center, and we had to cooperate jointly with the University of Maryland Hospital System and the Johns Hopkins System, as well as the Adventist System and many other hospitals that are part of the Maryland Hospital Association. We would also have to work with the Department of Health medical planners to procure various modular intensive care units, trailers, that would have adjacencies to many hospitals. The first ones we had to deal with were at Prince George's County Hospital and then Fort Washington. And then we also had to acquire sprung tents and 100 10-person alternative medical care tents, as well as ICU tents that we were going to have to set up for Hagerstown and Jessup correctional facilities. Part of the challenge was time, because we only had a few weeks to be able to do this. In addition to the challenge were what I refer to as the lists that we received from the medical planners and the hospitals. These lists had pages of all types, manner of hospital and medical gear, supplies, equipment, durable medical equipment, consumables, and of course, PPE, the personal protective equipment, the goggles, gloves, and gowns, and ventilators. Everything had to be sourced, procured, delivered, tested, and accepted by the clinical personnel in these COVID environments. Being able to meet the life, health, and safety needs of all the hospital staff, the clinical staff, and we'd also have to meet the needs of the first responders, law enforcement, and others operating throughout the state, and who would be operating around COVID patients. That was our dominant concern at that point. We had approximately 30 days, and in the case of the field hospital in Baltimore, we had a little over a week. And frankly, none of our procurement officers have ever operated at that pace, with that intensity, with these types of categories of goods and services in such a short period of time and with such a need. We operated with the admonition that we're not going to look like Italy, and we're not going to have our people in garbage bags. And I remember that admonition distinctly. But then all of a sudden, our personal protective equipment well ran dry. We couldn't find PPE anywhere. No supplier could provide it. None of the national medical suppliers that we generally use, or even the hospitals use. The hospitals couldn't provide it. The national contracting cooperatives couldn't provide it. Neither could the national associations. No one had PPE, and our challenge was to find enough ventilators, gowns, masks, goggles, gloves, and all of that material to meet the health and safety need. And I would say that we did it. Over the course of the last 10 weeks, we've acquired over 500 million items of goggles, gowns, gloves, and we did it through what I refer to as the emergency procurement method of procurement. If I could digress for just a moment, I'm looking at the Code of Maryland regulations regarding emergency procurements, and it defines an emergency as a sudden and unexpected occurrence or condition which agency management reasonably could not foresee that requires an action to avoid or to mitigate serious damage to public health, safety, and welfare. The emergency method of procurement requires us to use competition to the extent practicable. And I think we all understand that practicability in a time such as this was very difficult when no one could provide any of the materials that we were looking for. The emergency procurement process allowed us a level of both rigor as well as flexibility. And it allowed us to work with the Maryland Department of Health, the Hospital Association, and local authorities to ensure a level of systematic and deliberate decision-making, which we used on a weekly, daily, and an hourly basis. Phone calls were sometimes minute by minute when we needed to meet our operational needs. The emergency procurement method is designed for these purposes, and we were able to vet our suppliers through a very deliberative process in coordination with MEMA, Commerce, MDH, and others. So what I'd like to do is outline slide number 6, which shows the process that we used to meet the challenges that I just outlined. So this chart, slide 6, and I'll pause for a second, Mr. Chairman, as that slide comes up.
It's up, Mr. Gleason. You can proceed.
Okay, sir. That General Services Procurement Process slide indicates the vetting process that we used to ensure that the suppliers that we could use would be reliable. Basically, it's a 4-step process. The first column on the far left is what I would refer to as the intake process. We were deluged with a number of people who asked to offer us goods and services, and we would direct them all to MEMA, to the resource.mema@maryland.gov website. At that website, we would ask all suppliers to provide certain basic pieces of information regarding their business. And I'm not going to outline, sir, out of respect of our time, all 11 things, but these are basic elements that any business has to have in order to function. Following that, we would move to the yellow column. This is the Commerce Review, the Department of Commerce, where they had a team of people who would check businesses. They would check the information that the suppliers had provided. They have a Dun & Bradstreet subscription, so they could check their DUNS number, credit risk profile, etc. Once they went through that process, they would go to DGS, and we had a spreadsheet that we followed daily that would allow us to look at those suppliers that Commerce had vetted. DGS would then check those suppliers to make sure that the products that they were providing, not so much the business, but the products and services that they were providing, met our standard of need for the Department of Health, our client, as well as MEMA. We would check the quantities, product availability, shipping to Hanover and Sparrows Point, as well as the specifications. Once they passed through that step, then it would go on to step 4 for us to source. I'll point out here that the procurement piece is the last step. And typically what we would do is try to use our existing contracts. We may have heard of the FEMA stockpile, the strategic stockpile. That was oftentimes our first choice, but we found out very quickly that the stockpile was not able to provide our needs. So then we would go to our existing contracts, and our existing contracts were not able to provide many of our needs, especially for PPE. And then we would go to our cooperative contracts with other public bodies, and to the extent that that could not fill our needs, then we would do, as the Secretary referred to, market spot procurements would be done. And that's where primarily most of our PPE came from. And as I pointed out, after that process, over the next 6 to 8 weeks, we have been able to fulfill our product needs in the warehouse. So that essentially is our process that we went through. I've walked us through that, and that summarizes the challenges that we faced and then the processes that we use to meet our needs. And I believe that we've been able to satisfactorily acquire the materials and equipment the state needs at present. It doesn't answer the questions about the future and how we're able to build sustainment in our supply chain, but I will pause here and respond to any questions that you might have or members of the committee.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, let me also add one other item, and that is we've referenced, and we can talk more about it should the committee like to hear, about phase 2, which is the replenishment strategy. It's more of a long-term strategy now that we're in a pause. I'll also note that provided for the committee, but not a part of the slide presentation, was a white page concerning entitled Emergency Purchase Narrative, which discusses the topic of, as crafted by the Department, General Services, of fair market value. And Mr. Chairman, that does conclude our brief presentation. We're cognizant of time, and we want to leave as much time as possible for, I know, the questions that are there. So we will pause.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary and Mr. Gleason. We can go to full screen. Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the comments, and I appreciate one thing Mr. Gleason just said a couple of minutes ago, that we vet our supplier through a very deliberative process. I think that's a direct quote. And I'm glad you do that because obviously it's taxpayer money. So I want to on one of the contracts, if I could, for a minute. One of the contracts was with a company called Blue Flame. It was incorporated in Delaware on March 23rd, and I believe they received a contract 6 or 7 days later from the state. So they were in business either 6 days or 7 days, I'm not sure. After the conditions of the contract were not met and they didn't deliver the product, I do understand it was canceled and forwarded to the Attorney General's office. So I'm going to steer clear of legal issues because I know it could be in courts, but I do have some questions about public record, many of which have been reported on. First, was a contract with Blue Flame, was that one put to bid, or was that as a result of them reaching out to the department or the administration?
Mr. Chairman, and to answer that directly, like a majority of our purchases, this was a contract or an overture to the state that did go through our process and was evaluated. When we talk about bids, that's a part of our phase 2 strategy for replenishment. So
I appreciate that. So let me ask this. When did they reach out to the administration with an offer to broker masks? Do you know what date that was?
Well, I'd have to go back to the records. It was in March. I do not have it in front of me, and the reason I can speak to it is because this was one that came directly to me. So I know it was a Sunday. I'd have to go back and check my record, but I can get back to the committee concerning that. March 29th. Thank you. March 29th.
The 29th. So they reached out, and the next day they were given the bid. Is that my understanding?
No.
It's my understanding they were given the bid on the 30th.
No, I don't believe that is correct.
Just a second.
it has been reported that it was given on the 30th. And I would love to be able to be, I'd love for you to correct me and that it was sometime later.
We're checking, Mr. Chairman, as part of our official record. It's April 1st.
Okay.
April 1st, yes.
Okay, so 2 days later, they reached out to you on Sunday the 29th, and 2 days later, their contract was approved. Is that correct?
Well, for the sake of issuing the PO, that seems to be correct. Again, I'd like to go back and check our official record.
Okay, so they called you on Sunday, and on Tuesday, they were given a contract worth $12.5 million. So let me go to the next question, and I want to go back to your quote. You vet your supplier through a very deliberate process. This company was in business for 6 days. What kind of place to approve their contract when they had done absolutely zero business before requesting the contract with Maryland?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, you're going to have to repeat your question because you're breaking up.
I apologize. If they reached out to you on Sunday and they were approved for a contract on Tuesday, and you have said that you vet your supplier through a very deliberative process, and they had actually only been incorporated for 6 days and actually had no track record, what kind of vetting process did you put them through?
Tier 2. Well, Mr. Chairman, we had conversations with the vendor to understand their material. We looked at their resource material that was provided that showed partnering with supply chains in China where this was being produced. We also had their record, or purported record. When we were reviewing the information, we relied, of course, heavily on their partner that was indicated in writing, and tried to do some background checks on them. Again,
Mr. Secretary, it's
yes.
my understanding that the two principals of the company, Blue Flame, until March 23rd, had no experience with procuring PPE material. Their only experience was raising money for national elected officials in Washington. So I'm a little confused about looking at their resumes and their past work experience that allowed you to approve a $12.5 million contract in 48 hours.
Mr. Chairman, there are a great number of vendors that reached out to the department in a short period of time that had incorporations. We, as a part of procurement, we don't look at who the principal is in terms of the company. What we are most concerned about, especially during this time period, was the ability to execute.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is Robert Gleason.
Sure.
If I could add, at about, not this exact time, but around this same period of time, I do recall that ventilators were a very scarce resource that we were trying earnestly to acquire. And the chief procurement officer from an adjoining jurisdiction, I know and understand, I know well, and I understand it was related to me that he had someone on the ground in China, and he had a deal for ventilators, and he received word from his agent that his order, his contract, was being canceled because an Indian state, part of the South Asia, had procured the next 6 months of production capacity from that factory, and he was informed that his order was being canceled. And it was that sort of an environment where the sources to acquire these things were operating in that sort of a spontaneous, combustible environment that, as context. So I'm not addressing the particulars of this person, but I do know that it's
not, Mr. Gleason, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate you using the word combustible. Let me ask you a couple more quick questions, and I'll pass it on to the other committee members. In the few days of March, after they reached out, did either of you have contact with anybody in the governor's office? And if so, who was it and on what day?
In reference to what, Mr. Chairman?
Reviewing, considering, and approving the Blue Flame contract, did either of you have contact with anybody in the governor's office, either offering advice or making suggestions? It's a very simple question. Did you have any conversation with the governor's executive office staff?
Well, that's why I wanted to make sure that I had the correct frame in terms of the question. The answer is no. In this case, and in all cases, we stayed within the guardrails of our procurement methodology, meaning try and, yes, we acknowledge, of course, that in the beginning we were working very quickly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that these were forced circumstances. So, no, we stayed within the methodology of our procurement. The procurement team reviewed this, evaluated the ventilators that were being offered with the Department of Health, also looked at the mask. It was deemed that the products that they were providing were acceptable for use in Maryland, and we moved forward with a purchase order.
Okay, so Mr. Secretary, I just want to be very clear on this. You're telling these committees that in those last few days of March, after this company reached out to you, or immediately before, and during approval, those 48 hours or the 48 hours before they reached out to you, you had a phone call, email, or meeting with any member of the staff of the governor relating to Blue Flame?
I can say, and I can certainly go back to my record, since again this came through me, and the referral came through another member of the governor's team, but no conversations were held with that person. No conversations were held with the governor's team specifically concerning giving a contract to Blue Flame Medical based on any relationship. We were not looking at relationships. We were looking simply at what could be established as fulfillment for any particular vendor.
Okay, so you said the referral came from the governor's team. Who referred this company to you?
Several referrals that have come from them.
As I think I'm going to leave it just at this point. It was a member of the governor's team, just like I am a member of the governor's team. And we received referrals. We received referrals from many different individuals, from members of the House of Delegates.
Mr. Secretary, I won't belabor the matter, but in some, you approved a $12.5 million contract on 48 hours of review and vetting to a company that had absolutely zero experience in procuring this type of material. Is that right or is that not right?
It's partners. Sir, Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to speak to the facts of the case.
Okay.
And that is the referral was made. We entered them into the system. We evaluated the offer. We had follow-up conversations to understand capability to fulfill the offer, and we moved forward with a purchase order.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me go on to the committee. I have other questions, but I will the floor to my committee colleagues. If you want to speak, go to participant and click on raise hand, and then I will recognize you. Don't all raise your hand at once. Okay, Senator Kagan, please unmute Senator Kagan.
I've just done that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Churchill, Mr. Gleason, thank you for being with us today. I'm going to follow up on some of the chairman's questions. So in my district, I don't know if you saw the piece in Maryland Matters today, but two of the very most tragic nursing home series of cases and deaths are in my district. Hollingswood has had 103 cases as of today, with 33 deaths among residents, staff cases 42 with 1 death. Potomac Valley, where this all started, similar, I'm not going to go through all the data, but 23 deaths among residents. It's a huge problem. If you would go back to slide 4, I believe it was, and slide 6. Slide 4, and there are a number of us who've been chatting who noticed this, but as the chairman pointed out, the distribution numbers were not there. And we all saw the press about the excitement and the hopefulness about getting 500,000 PPE sets from South Korea, thanks to our First Lady. But then the question of the lack of swabs and reagents arose fairly quickly, which has not gotten the same amount of attention. The question to you is, have we gotten that information? What's the current status? And how soon are we going to make sure that staff and residents of our nursing homes can get the attention they need so we don't continue to have the spread, the peak, and the deaths that are happening there?
Thank you, Senator Kagan. Your question is best asked to the Maryland Department of Health. Our department, the Maryland Department of General Services, is tasked with ordering the materials that are identified from the Maryland Department of Health. And as it relates to testing supplies, because the Maryland Department of Health is the subject matter expert, they are the ones that are essentially placing any orders for this type of supply. So I'm sorry I cannot give you a direct answer to your question, but the Department of Health is really the correct agency to speak to your question.
So with due respect, I understand that the Department of Health would have responsibility for prioritizing distribution, but it's DGS who handles procurement. So in terms of placing the order, spending taxpayer money, and making sure that the orders come in correctly and as promised, that seems to fall into DGS's domain. Am I wrong?
Well, you would be correct if it was a new procurement, but the materials for swabs and the other testing material is a part of their contract structure. And so I'm not in a position to answer that, because they already have some predetermined contracts that provide that material supply. Plus, I believe they, the federal government is providing some supplies as well that are being used as a part of this COVID-19 response.
Thank you. Let's go to Senator Lamb. Senator Lamb, please unmute him, please.
Sure. Thank you, Senator Pinsky. I had a question about Blue Flame and then also about the tests themselves, but I guess generally, were there any medical people that were helping in making some of these procurement decisions, particularly when it comes to how much you need and whether or not the needs and requests that have been put forward adequately match the needs that we're seeing out in the community? Having some input from folks that in the medical field might be helpful to addressing some of these requests. Was there anyone that had medical background that was helping with a lot of these PPE requests that had come forward and such?
Thank you, Senator Lamb, for that question. It's a very good question. And I think we all sit around the table and we've said we're certainly an agency that's better situated to order commodities like masks. I don't think you want a procurement officer to make a determination on a ventilator. And so, yes, the answer to your question directly is yes. That in any case when materials were offered, we referred the material for approval to the Maryland Department of Health, and once we received that, then we moved on to the next stage, which was to understand the capabilities of the vendor and potential timeframes if we were going to move into an order. So, and who looked at the materials depended on the particular specialty that was being requested.
Okay. So I think that would be helpful, particularly when it comes to some of the more expensive medical equipment. So I just saw a tweet from Jane Miller who was highlighting the fact that from that prior chart, there were, it looked like 1,600 ICU vents that were requested, but only 2 received as of now. Can you speak to why only 2 out of 1,600 were received?
Well, sure. I mean, this is this chart was. I have to go back and look in terms of health, in terms of when it was entered. I can tell you, I can confirm that we have more than 2 ICU ventilators in the warehouse, and I can get back to you or to the committee concerning that. But also, in the chart, there are mobile vents that were ordered and as a part of the process, and they were also approved by the Maryland Department of Health, and under that item, there are 451 in the warehouse. And then finally, Health would have to speak to this, but I believe the first vents that were distributed and continue to be distributed are the ones that are coming from the federal government. And I'll pause there.
Okay. With regards to Blue Flame, when you were going through the process, that 4-step process that you mentioned, you had also cited the fact that DGS does not check on the business itself, but checks on the products that potentially would be procured to make sure that they meet the requirements that you had outlined in step 3. So if you're only checking the products and not the business, who in the procurement process is actually checking the business and the background of the business?
As a part of our process, and generally, as of toward the end of April, the business, the viability, where the business resides, the license of the business, the pre-screened score or Dun & Bradstreet score, and there were some additional requirements in terms of international companies, were reviewed by the Department of Commerce. Now, once we received that, we had in most all cases, We had follow-up conversations, and as the 60-day period has matured, I think we've definitely gotten better at our process to understand that what the vendor is claiming is actually something that can be relied upon. And we're doing that from making calls to any references, talking with other states, asking more specifics about the supply chain contracts that they have. So that is the general process.
But with all due respect to what you just cited, the things that you cited about the actual business themselves are really just basic identifiers. Like, does the business exist, right? Does it have an address? Is it properly registered with the state? It doesn't sound like there's any second level scrutiny that these businesses undergo for very large procurement contracts that are going out to actually see if they have the background to be able to do this, to make sure that there are no concerns in the public domain that cite the fact that they may not be able to fulfill this request, any other vetting by the businesses. So, for example, I guess there was a political report that cited the fact that Blue Flame may have some concerns in their background, and that report was actually put out in Politico probably a couple days before our procurement actually went through. So, that may have even just popped up on a basic Google search. Is any of that done beyond just the basic identifiers of whether that business exists?
Yes, Senator. Of course, there were other things that were done, and it was unique to each individual case. Again, I'm going to frame the point based on Blue Flame, where we were in this COVID-19 response. For this office, at that time, it was a matter of life and death for Marylanders entering into our health system. And so we were reliant on trying to act quickly to get materials into the system. And that was our best opportunity at the time, and which is why we went to contract with that vendor.
Okay. I'd like to talk about the tests that came in, the 500,000 tests that were procured from South Korea. And, I guess it sounds like the distribution of those tests are under the Maryland Department of Health, and we were hoping to have a joint COVID call with MDH this morning, but they canceled, so we're not able to get some of those questions answered. But since you are handling the procurement of items that would be needed by the state, my understanding is that they're missing some pieces to be able to actually use these tests. So if they're missing pieces, have they reached out to you to procure the missing pieces?
Senator, I'm unaware of what you're referencing. I can only speak to the procurement where we entered into the engagement in March. Your question is, of course, should be answered by the Department of Health, and I'm sorry I cannot answer you directly.
With all due respect, there's, what the governor stated at press conferences are that, they don't have the swabs, they may not have the reagents, and they don't have the testing equipment. So from a medical standpoint, as a scientist, if you're missing the swabs and you're missing the reagents and you're missing the testing equipment, I'm not sure what else is left that could have been procured, right? And so if that's not accurate, if that statement is not accurate, and something is missing, right? Because if something weren't missing, these tests would be used right now. The tests have not really been used. And so therefore something else needs to be procured for these tests to actually be used. Has anyone reached out to you to procure the missing components that would allow these tests to be used? You're the procurement people, right? Has anyone reached out to you about that?
It is correct that we are the Office of State Procurement. but there are different threshold levels that, in terms of what departments have authority to order. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole on tests, but any and all tests have multiple components, and the Maryland Department of Health does have certain components available. They may be in scarce supply, but they have contracts that they can utilize, and I believe that they do routinely to bring materials into their labs. So no, this is not a new procurement. No new procurement for swabs or reagents or anything of that order rests with the Department of General Services.
Just before we leave, Dr. Lamb, Senator Lamb, I just want everyone to be clear. Who approved the purchase of the test kits, the incomplete test kits? Who has responsibility for the other components? It's not the health department. They don't write the checks to buy this material. And I think I didn't get a clear answer to Dr. Lamb's question. If you approved an incomplete test kit, 500,000 of them, did you know they were incomplete? And why did he purchase them not having the necessary equipment to make them functional?
To answer your question, you really have to understand the components of a test kit. The 500,000 units were one component of the test. This is not an off-the-shelf a product that someone can take down and to the local lab and then use it. It does require other components. And again, and this is something that the Department of Health is not new, continues to do. And so before this crisis, they were taking tests, and they have a supply chain for different components of the test. So we're only talking about one component that was assisted in terms of a procurement for from the Maryland Department of General Services. Your question, again, is better answered by the Maryland Department of Health.
Mr. Chairman, can I have one just last follow-up question, and then I'll wrap here?
Sure.
And I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if that worked with folks. So this is, and I don't know if you can see this, but this is the application to FDA for these lab tests that came from South Korea. It's from Lab Genomics. And if you actually scroll down to page 5 of the application itself, they're very explicit in what is included in the test kit. So what's included in the test kit are those components that are listed at the top there. And then what is not included in the test kit are these items that are down here, right? So materials required but not provided. And I'm not sure if DGS, you can actually see those materials or not. So, you know, what you see here are some machines like a thermocycler to help actually run the test. You see RNA extraction kits. These are some reagents that are listed here that would need to be bought from QIAGEN, which is a scientific materials company. And then the last of these are all just kind of lab consumables, right? So water, a centrifuge, microcentrifuge tubes, refrigerators, freezers, et cetera. So, you know, it's explicit here what is included in the test kit and what's not. And so what on this list is not included that would still need to be procured, right? So a thermocycler is pretty expensive. It's a couple $100,000 or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. The RNA extraction kits are some additional reagents. Those are pretty expensive too. And it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, no one from MDH has reached out to you to procure these additional items. Is that correct?
Senator Lamb, again, the Maryland Department of Health is the subject matter expert on this topic. I cannot speak for them in terms of what materials they have or they do not have. I can only speak to any procurement that's been requested of this department, and no request to secure anything else other than the what I believe we're calling the SA, which is the lab genomics component, has been handled by the Department of General Services.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the next, in a moment, we're going to go to Senator Washington. Then we're going to drop in Delegate Rosenberg from HCO, then Senator Patterson, followed by Senator Zucker from BMT. We'll go in that order. So let's unmute Senator Washington. Unmute Senator Washington, please.
I'll unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for joining us. And you really, we're highlighting and talking about what happened with Blue Flame and doing a deep dive on this procurement process. We do understand that there was a tremendous pressure. We do understand the weight. We're all feeling that pressure. We also know that this is an ongoing process. This is not something that is going to just simply end in a week or a month, and that the need and the pressures to procure under these circumstances are going to continue. So what we want to make sure is that there is that simply oversight and just isn't just thrown out, and that there is accountability and that there are processes. And I want to be very clear about what was learned by the missteps clearly, and what's the process going forward. So my questions are centered around that, to make sure that we understand your process, and then also that you understand the concerns that we are hearing from the public. And so I just want to ask, right now, so everything being funneled through the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, or what's the approval and oversight process of contracts right now? Just
thank you. This is Robert Gleason. So we've gone through what the Secretary referred to as the phases. We went through the first phase, and I can't remember exact terminology, but it was more of a react and respond phase. And we're now considering what I would refer to as a phase 2, which would be more of a greater degree of vigilance. I think the rest of the world has caught up with the need to fill the supply chain with necessary goods and products that we're looking for. So we have a moment to pause, reflect, and readjust ourselves to do things in maybe with greater rigor, or some degree of oversight than maybe what we had in the beginning. I would characterize that as phase 2, longer term. And then beyond that, I think we need to look at how we respond as a state with regards to our own supply chain, our own stockpile, our own equipment and support that we can do without necessarily having to be reliant on foreign powers, or maybe a supply chain that doesn't exist within the state or within even the country, or much less the stockpile, the federal stockpile. So I think we'll be able to be much more responsible and responsive in sort of this later phase. But I think I'll pause there and see if that helps to answer your question, ma'am.
So right, just to clarify, so right now, due to the emergency, right? So the Board of Public Works is simply notified of large procurements that you don't have to get approval. Is that correct?
No, we still have to report. And
so, there's no oversight on the state contracts, since the agency awarding the contracts, which is, DGS and the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, only has to notify, not get approval. And I agree with you, there has to be a better way. I mean, what a large concern is, didn't just stress it, that sorry, I couldn't hear.
I'm sorry. I'm saying the board.
Understanding.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. The Board of Public Works can remand it back for further action by the agency. And I would also say that we can now use greater competition now that we have a warehouse that has some of the necessary products in it. we can take the time to take a competitive approach. So I'll pause there.
Okay. So I'm actually very happy to hear that. A huge concern is that how can we ensure that small businesses, small Maryland businesses that weren't established for the purpose of, by politically connected entities to get a lucrative contract, but actually small businesses and minority and women-owned businesses, how do we ensure that they're not excluded from this process? What steps are you taking? Now that in your own words, you have the time and lessons learned.
Yes, ma'am. We're very conscious of the small businesses, especially the minority business, veteran businesses, all of the types of businesses that we would routinely, normally, and seek out to do business with. We can now engage in a much more deliberative, systematic way using our EMA technology, using the rules of engagement through our competitive processes, and be able to take care of that. I would say too that there is some good news. I mean, out of all of the orders that we did and that we reported to the Board of Public Works, I think the value that we reported was $269 million, almost $270 million. Over 60 of those orders were with Maryland companies. That's 57%. I'm just looking at the figures here. Were with Maryland companies. And almost 35% of the total value was with Maryland companies. We actually had a very deliberative way in terms of looking at small businesses, minority businesses, Maryland businesses. As we would go within a framework of time, we would step through. This is not a law, it's not a regulation, it's not a rule, but it was more of a practice that we internally engaged in to see if we could answer a demand need using all of those socioeconomic indicators of businesses until we could finally get on base in order to get a contract for something that was needed within days or a week or some number of days, and to find a supplier that would do that. So we actually had a process that we would go through that we shared internally.
Again, with all due respect, our process, we want to be very clear that the process does not repeat the problems of the past. So I'm glad that a little more than half of the companies are Maryland-based. I'll assert again that hopefully these are companies that were not just formed in the last few days and have a history and a track record. We've learned that lesson, hopefully. But you did not answer specifically how many are women-owned, how many are African-American or other minority businesses, and what specific steps. You gave us some steps, 1, 2, 3, 4. You said you had 11 for your procurement process that any business would use. What are your specific steps of ensuring or engaging women-owned, minority, African-American businesses in this process? And I'm working with the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, I'm assuming.
Get back to Yes, ma'am. So the figures I have here states that we had over 34 million with minority businesses, and we had 32 million with small businesses. And for any further detail, I'd have to get back to you and look at the analytics on that. I just don't have that in front of me.
That would be great. I think the committee would appreciate that. And also, Mr. Chairman and committee members, I'm very concerned about this oversight process. And I'm just wondering in general, there's got to be a better way. Should there be some other oversight board created that's non-political that can ensure transparency and inclusion? I don't know if the secretary would find that helpful, but I really have that concern. And that is a rhetorical, that's an isn't it so question.
Yeah, Senator, we can take that up at a later point, but thank you for raising it. Let's go to Delegate Rosenberg. Welcome, Delegate Rosenberg. Please unmute Delegate Rosenberg.
Thank you, Chairman Pinsky. I have 2 questions. Am I being heard? Oh, hold on, I'm muted.
No, you're muted. Sandy, you're muted.
Now can I be heard?
Perfect.
Thank you. Two questions. I don't know if it was Mr. Churchill or Mr. Gleason, you said that we look at the ability of a company to execute. Is there language in the code that speaks to that, that guides you in that regard? If you know that offhand, fine. If you don't, if you could help us. Just would like to know what guides you when you're using that standard of we look at the ability to execute. You also spoke of an inevitable competition with, for instance, between the state and the hospital association is one example. Must there be a competition? Is there some way that we can revise this process because we have to assume and anticipate a next time so that there is not a competition between the state and the hospital association and other parties? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. This is Bob Gleason. With regards, let me start backwards with your last question. In terms of the competition, what I was referring to was the ability for us to acquire goods using more competitive methods, knowing that we have more time and we don't have to fill an immediate need in the next hour, day, or week. So to the extent that we have a greater ability to have more time, that allows us more time to competitively procure contracts for some of these critically needed items. To your point about competition with other entities, such as the hospital association, I think the entire world, it was a global competition between every public and every private entity in the world to get items that the supply chain just could not fulfill, nor were there any factories, manufacturers locally, or even domestically that could satisfy those needs. So we were in competition just as a nature of demand and supply. With the ability to execute, companies being able to execute, I think there's a reasonable due diligence with the extent that we can validate that either a tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3 partner of any supplier has demonstrated any prior experience to do that. Many of the companies that we're dealing with, major national corporations, have demonstrated the ability to perform in the past, yet they were unable to provide our needed goods at the moment that we needed them. So it was we were burning it on both ends of the candle there in our inability to be able to find a company that would execute. I would also add one more thing about the Maryland Hospital Association. We're actually working with them cooperatively, almost on a daily basis through MDH and also the MHA to make sure that their supply and logistical needs are not in competition with ours, but are more in alignment. So that's an ongoing activity that it may not have been on day one, but certainly by day 3 or 4 or 5, we understood what each other's needs were. So I'll pause there.
And then, if I may, Mr. Chairman,
Sure.
Thank you. How did you determine Blue Flame's ability to execute? What was your assessment of Blue Flame's ability to execute?
As I recall, it was further upstream in the supply chain. I believe there was a tier 2 or tier 3 distributor or reseller or someone that had the ability and had demonstrated some performance in the past.
What was the relationship between this tier 2 entity and Blue Flame?
I don't know the answer to that, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate Rosenberg. Senator Patterson, could we unmute Senator Patterson, please? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple questions. Let me just first go on record and say, the Blue Flame contract raised some severe concerns for me personally and for those of which I represent, such that I think perhaps we need to, at some later date, revisit this to see if we can get some additional information as to, number one, what did happen, and number two, what can we put in place to ensure this would not happen in the future. The other aspect I wanted to hit was that of the MBE program. And Senator Washington, you always get ahead of me for some reason, but I love you and that's okay. But I want to spin down a little bit more about that because I had a Zoom meeting on Saturday with a business group here in my district, and they gave me holy hell about procurement. What is the process? What are we doing for MBEs and those kind of things? And I had the secretary say, yeah, well, I understand the emergency, so we probably didn't have to put all the pieces in place to summarize. But I think henceforth in the future, we're going to have to do some backfills here. And I think we need to make sure that we give special emphasis and consideration to ensure that we are tapping MBEs and small businesses in the state and in this case in my county as well. So those would be the concerns that I would have. And I would hope that even with what we got on page 6, I believe it is, the first column at the bottom, if we still could get some kind of breakout, if you would, in terms of just how, what minorities got awarded this time around, if any. If we can get dollar amounts associated with that, that would be helpful too. So those would be my major concern. I have an obligation to report back to the group that gave me hell Saturday night, Saturday afternoon next week. So I'm anxious to get some definitive answers so I can take it back to them. Thank you. Did they?
We are here. I don't. We thank you for those comments. It is a part of our deliberations. This is Secretary Churchill, and we are trying to be transparent. At one point, I was in business development, and I understand if you don't know about an opportunity, you can't respond to an opportunity. And so that's why we're trying to make sure that the process is consistent for all contractors, including our MBE and small business community. And so in a short order of time, our phase 2 strategy will be out on email and marketplace, where any and all vendors will be able to respond to create a pool of contractors supplying PPE and medical supply. I'll also note, of course, that we are very cognizant of our system that is in place, and we will be inviting any contractor, and we have looked at 6 different categories in the MDOT system, which is about 100 or so vendors that may be duplications in terms of what they can supply, to participate as a part of this this next engagement. It is a long-term engagement, and so we want to make sure that we extend a big tent to gain as much participation within the process. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Senator Zucker, could we unmute Senator Zucker from Budget and Tax?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 quick questions. First is, I believe it's on page 5. There is a county breakdown in terms of what you all are doing. Oh, actually, no, on page 5, it would be the breakdown in terms of the distribution. There's no fiscal amount there. Are you able to, at some point, put in how much you actually spent on these items?
We report all items to the board with spend level, so that it is transparent. Also, we have to post on email and marketplace, any contract that we release, and that is available for anyone to see.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say that if you were going to update the slides with what the chairman wanted in terms of distribution information, maybe you could put the fiscal cost. And then the last, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, is there was a slide, and I think I understand it. It was on page 6 in terms of county assistance. And I was just wondering if you have a certain vendor that you're using that we trust, the state of Maryland trusts, and you know that Maryland has met its capacity in terms of what it's going to be spending right now on PP at that moment. Are you communicating with other procurement officers in the counties to let them know what opportunities might be available for them to purchase PP? And thank you very much for your time.
Any one of our local procurement officers can source their products on their own. We do have a database of vendors that have been, of course, we've referenced that we're part of the emergency vendor database as started by Commerce. That is available for any procurement officer to access, and then we have our any vendors on Emma. But any local procurement officer that has a question, they certainly can reach out to our office, the Office of State Procurement, and the last slide, of course, has our Chief Procurement Officer's information, and so they can certainly be in contact, and we can follow up. And I'll pause.
Thank you. Senator Fry Hester, could we unmute Senator Fry Hester? Still muted. Still, can we unmute Senator Fry Hester?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
See you too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Secretary, for being here, and your team for being here to answer our questions. So I've been tracking the data on the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, and they've got a really interesting page that looks at how all the states stack up. And Maryland isn't. I'm looking at the statistics for how many tests Maryland has done per 100K, and you look at like Rhode Island has 13,000 tests for 100K. New York has 9,000, New Jersey 7, DC 6, Delaware 5.6, and Maryland's kind of down in the bottom 30% with 4,000 tests per 100K. And so I'm just curious if when we have these tests available, people line up to take them. So has Maryland, first of all, why is Maryland kind of at the bottom third? Secondly, has there been any other procurement requests to purchase more tests? And third, I'm just curious if there's, where the weakest link is. Are we waiting for more from the feds? Are they holding back? And how can we help? So I know that's a lot, but just taking it up to that really high level, I'm just curious if you can answer any of those questions for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator, for your question. And again, I'm unfamiliar with the Johns Hopkins Resource Report. Your question is best asked to the subject matter expert. We are not the subject matter expert on your question. And
okay, well, let me rephrase the question, because I think we could assume that if the tests were available, they might be being used. So I'm just curious, have you been have there been requests to secure more tests, and are you expecting any more tests from the federal government?
Again, that question is best asked to the Maryland Department of Health. We're unable to answer your question.
So you can't tell me whether you've received requests for more tests, to purchase more tests?
That was a pretty straightforward question, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, are you with us still?
Yes, I've answered the question.
No.
That question is because you've asked already about components and tests. I think that was with Senator Lamb. That question should be asked for the Maryland Department of Health.
So you don't know if there have been requests for more tests? I mean, you would have to purchase them, I think is what Senator Fry Hester is getting to, and that you should be in that loop. And you're saying you're not in that loop? Yes or no?
Senator, I believe I've answered the question. Mr. Chairman, I've answered the question. That question is best answered with the Maryland Department of Health.
Okay. Any other questions, Senator? Okay. Well, let me, I see, I have one other question. I see no other questions from the committee. We have to go back to the South Korean tests just for a minute. Dr. Lamb posted the specifications of what was included in the test and what wasn't. And I guess my question to you, Mr. Secretary, is when the governor and his staff were negotiating with South Korea, did you notify them that half, 2/3, or 3/4 of the testing components were not included in what he was purchasing?
Mr. Chairman, again, the component that we ordered, one component of the test, that was understood. The Maryland Department of Health is the subject matter expert and was guiding the process to acquire tests. Your question is best asked to the Maryland Department of Health.
Yeah, again, I have to say, you're abdicating responsibility. For 2 weeks, we saw on national TV that Santa Claus had landed in Maryland, and you had procured 500,000 tests with the administration to save our lives, to have testing. And Dr. Lamb has showed us that multiple parts of the testing were not included. And if it was announced that we bought these tests, and in fact, they weren't complete tests, we not only deceived Marylanders, we deceived the nation. And because you are the person who oversees procurement along with the governor, if large components of the testing were not included, someone had to raise a flag and make that clear, at least to the governor in his negotiations. And if you didn't do that, it seems to me, a lot of people were misled as to what we purchased. I hate to call it a pig in a poke, but the Department of Health didn't buy those. They didn't negotiate with South Korea. You, as the person who vets these materials, look at the specifications, and Dr. Lamb actually showed us from the document what would not be included. And we're all wondering, are we losing lives because of it? Earlier in regarding Blue Flame, you said you made a quick decision because it was a matter of life and death. Here we have 500,000 tests, which for a month were sitting in a warehouse because they weren't complete. If anything is a matter of life and death, testing people across the state in nursing homes and other congregate living, in prisons, in our neighborhoods, in schools, in September teachers, whatever. If there's ever a matter of life and death, having complete test kits would be it. But yet you use that justification in talking about giving 48-hour approval to Blue Flame. So if you can better illuminate myself and the committee members on this, we'd be happy to hear it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to try not to sound like a broken record. As a part of any procurement process, you have to have a subject matter expert. The subject matter expert for test was the Maryland Department of Health. Yes, we did assist, but the evaluation of the product was a part of the process for the Maryland Department of Health. And since they are the subject matter expert, they would be aware of what is included or not included as a part of the evaluation, which would be a compatibility with Maryland labs. So again, your question is best asked to the Maryland Department of Health.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Before closing, look, and I'm speaking for myself, not for the committee at this point. Your department does a yeoman's job, and on most of these contracts under very difficult circumstances, you came across and got very important life-saving equipment for the people of Maryland. So I applaud you, Mr. Gleason, everyone else in your department. You've done great work, by and large. Two areas that have raised red flags are areas that fall under political decisions. One was purchasing Blue Flame contract on 40 hours notice, and then they didn't deliver, which proves the point that they were not vetted appropriately. And because the two principals were Republican fundraisers on the national scene, and they got this contract. And the second was the purchase of 500,000 test kits from South Korea, which got publicity across the nation, possibly across the globe, when in fact they weren't complete test kits. But it gave publicity to the governor without helping the lives of Marylanders, and you were complicit in that. So by and large, in all the contracts I've looked at, they've been responsible, respectful, appropriately vetted. The two areas that have come up today with these committees, and personally, are two areas that bend in the area of politics. And unfortunately, they were mistakes, disasters, and I think you were complicit in it. But, you know, I don't want to put you under the bus. I think someone has already done that for us. So I want to thank you for participating today. I want to thank Mr. Gleason. Anybody else, obviously the committee from the EHE, HGO, and the Budget and Tax, and all of our staff. So with that, this brings to a close this hearing and briefing. Thank you, be safe, have a great day.